Howdy readers, I'm Jason. This is Chapter and Verse, and this is my latest video in my mortality project, which I've been doing throughout the year, watching films and reading books on the subject of death. The project is called You Carry a Coffin Today, and the book that I read for this month is Julian Barnes' memoir, Nothing to be Frightened of. Barnes is best known as a novelist. He won the Booker Prize for The Sense of an Ending. I read his novel Arthur and George many years ago with my book club, which was also a finalist for the Booker Prize. So this is his memoir about death, about his own kind of nervousness about death, his own worry, his own kind of ceaseless inquiry into what he feels on the subject of death and why. So Barnes is an agnostic, and he really comes at the question of death from, I would say, a position of apprehension. The first line in the book is, "I don't believe in God, but I miss him." And so from the get-go, we have this sense of Barnes kind of straddling two worlds, right? A world of terrific certainty and a world of, I don't know, I suppose longing might be a good way to put it. Longing for something that he fears isn't there, but he wishes were there. So given his agnosticism, the title of the book can be taken in two ways. And because of that, I really feel like it's one of the best titles I've ever read, especially given what lies between the covers. So is the title Nothing to be Frightened of? Meaning an atheist notion, right, of the cessation of being, that, you know, when one dies, existence just ends, it ceases, it's just a full stop, right? So nothing as nothingness, really, nothingness to be frightened of. Or is it nothing to be frightened of, right? This sense of Christian reassurance that consciousness or the soul persists, that it goes on somehow, however mysteriously. That death is not a full stop, but a transition. And he's always kind of going back and forth between these things. Although he is more disposed, I think, to disbelief than belief. That might change for him were he to attend a church service at some point. He admits in the book that he has never been to a church service proper. He's gone to weddings and, you know, baptisms and funerals and such, but he's never actually attended a church service. Given how he is an agnostic who is not in the least inclined to dismiss faith, that he does seem curious about it, I find it a little bit strange, a little bit puzzling that he's never attended a church service, that his experience of religion is strictly academic. It's strictly through reading. I find it puzzling and I find it unfortunate because, as somebody who is a person of faith, I know firsthand that the experience of religion that one gets in a church setting, going to services, especially when one is hearing a really complicated sermon given by a pastor or a minister who understands his or her voice as a tool, as an instrument, given that, given liturgy, and given the notion of worshiping and reciting and reflecting in a communal way, amongst other believers, or more accurately, amongst other people who are seeking, who are questioning, who are wondering, who are hoping, who are fearing, who are filled with anxiety themselves. Because that's what you get at a church service. It's not a bunch of people who are fixed in their belief and are just kind of cocksure about everything. It's not what a church service is. It's a bunch of people who are wondering and fearing and hoping and trying very, very hard to love and allow themselves to be loved. Basically, I think that a person like Julian Barnes, who seems open to the idea of religion, of believing being a more complicated thing than many agnostics and atheists seem to think that it is or can be. I find it a little bit strange that he has somehow skirted direct engagement with the possibility of believing or of religion. Anyway, returning to the main theme of the book, fear of death. Okay, so on page 62, Julian Barnes writes, we fall thereby into 4 categories, and it's clear which 2 regard themselves as superior. Those who do not fear death because they have faith, and those who do not fear death despite having no faith. These groups take the moral high ground. In third place come those who, despite having faith, cannot rid themselves of the old, visceral, rational fear. And then out of the meadows, below the salt, up Shit Creek, come those of us who fear death and have no faith. And when I read that, I found myself wondering, I suppose, what category do I fall into? And it occurred to me that there might be other categories. So I'm a person of faith, okay? And I don't particularly fear death, but I realized, or it became clearer to me, I suppose, reading this book. Again, I first read it, 10 or 11 years ago. It became clearer to me this time that despite not really fearing death, and despite being a believer, someone who does believe that consciousness moves beyond death somehow in some mysterious way, I don't think my not fearing death really has anything to do with my faith. And so I found myself wondering, okay, well, what then does it have to do with? And I think it has to do with the fact that over the last 15 years or so, or even 20 years actually, I have been in really close proximity to it, by which I don't necessarily mean that I've had friends who've died, which I have, or I've known people who've lost people who were even closer to them than friends. I have friends who've lost spouses in the last couple of years, and these are people who are in their 40s and 50s. It's not that. It's the fact that I have been part of things, part of events where it seems as though death were imminent, or that death had actually happened when it didn't. So the first time Kelly had a seizure, right? So as you guys know, my wife has epilepsy. And we had been married a year and a half, I think, when she had her first seizure. And I had never seen someone have a seizure before. I had no idea really what it looked like, and I had no reason to anticipate it, okay? And she was recovering from surgery, and she'd been home for a few days at that point. And we were watching Wimbledon on TV. And I had like a futon, and we had the futon turned in such a way that she could lay down and look directly at the TV at the foot of the futon. And I was in a chair sitting next to her. And she started having a grand mal seizure. And I had no idea what was happening. I just immediately panicked, grabbed the phone, called 911, and was just hysterical, really. And watching this happen to her. And while I was on the phone with the person there at the hospital, or the emergency line, wherever they were located, Kelly just went still. Right, her eyes were open, and she just went completely still. And I thought I had just watched my wife die. And I dropped the phone, ran over to her, started screaming for somebody in the apartment building to come help. And somehow I think some part of my brain realized what was going on, and knew that I needed to get her rolled onto her side, which I did, at which point she started breathing again. But I watched her go just slightly blue and just stop moving and just be completely still. And it looked to me as though she had died. So even though she didn't, like, I feel like I somehow passed through that, passed through that happening and I don't know, seeing her somehow come back to life. There was the time when my brother fell terribly ill. This was in my mid-20s, I suppose. I'm not even sure if they know to this day whether or not it was cancer, but they believed that it was. His bone marrow had stopped producing blood, or whatever the bone marrow does. And he had less than half of the blood in his body that he was supposed to have. And I still remember being in the hospital. This is my younger brother too, by the way. So he was in his early to mid-20s. And I remember the doctor letting us all know that they would be starting chemotherapy on him the following Monday. And I remember my brother starting to cry. And I left the room with a friend of ours. And, we went into the waiting room. And I just remember sitting there. We didn't talk, but I just remember sitting there watching my brother's best friend cry. And somehow, I feel like we passed through death, or we found ourselves in the territory of it. And as a family, we navigated it somehow. We made our way through it. And then there was this crazy time when we lived in Montana, and Kelly and I had come down to Wyoming to visit family, and we were on our way back to Montana, and the gas pedal stuck on our car as I was accelerating around another car on a highway, and the engine just raced and just would not stop. And I managed to get the car pulled off of the road, and shut the engine off when it was, I don't even know what the RPMs were. It was just insane. But through that whole process, Kelly and I were sure we were going to die. It lasted, I don't know, probably seconds, probably 20 seconds or 30 seconds. But it felt like a lifetime, and it was terrifying. And we were convinced that that was it, right? That we weren't going to be able to get control of the car, and that we were going to somehow go off the road and roll. And then a few years ago, my mother was in the hospital fighting sepsis. There was about, I don't know, 4 or 5 days, maybe as much as a week, where I was convinced that we were going to lose her. I was convinced that she was going to die. And it seemed like the rest of my family was as well. And everybody was just absolutely overwrought and panicked by this possibility, by this idea of what seemed to us to be a likelihood. And I found myself feeling like somebody had to be the stable one. Somebody had to be the strong one, I suppose, in that moment, and it seemed to fall to me by default. So yeah, I feel like that was another instance where death was somehow around us all. I found myself in a position where I had to somehow keep hold of the compass in the midst of all of that. With all of these examples, I feel a little bit like I have gone through kind of rehearsals of death, I suppose. I feel like I've seen it in such a way that it has required me to keep my head. I don't know, I just don't feel as frightened of it as I once did. That may change, right? When my time comes, if I know my time is coming, or in the moments before it happens, that may change. I am perfectly willing to admit that. But anyway, the book itself is, it's really sensitive. It's really perceptive. It's full of wonderful kind of literary and artistic anecdotes. Julian Barnes has a mind that is just clearly very curious, very roving, and it's just pleasant to spend time in his company. You would think that this book, given the subject matter, that it would be really grave, no pun intended, that it would be very, very gloomy, I suppose, but it's actually a very funny book in many ways. It actually made me laugh out loud a couple of times on this reread, and I would encourage all of you, if you didn't read it along with me this time for the project and for Nonfiction November, to give it a look. I wouldn't be at all surprised if this is the book Julian Barnes is most proud of having written. So, anyway, that is Nothing to be Frightened of. We have one more month in the project. December sees the end of it. And next month, we are going to be watching Patrice Leconte's film, The Widow of Saint-Pierre, with Juliette Binoche. And this is about a prisoner awaiting execution in France, in a village in France, and about the transformation that happens to him and to the people around him as he waits for his execution. And we're going to be reading Benediction by Kent Haruf, which is the third book in his Plainsong trilogy. These are books that do not need to be read in order. They are a trilogy of a town, of a community, not so much a linear story following exactly the same characters from A to B to C. I read this just a few years ago. This was the best reading experience of that year for me, so I am just burning to read it again. I can't wait, actually. So please join me for Benediction in December. I plan to have my video up on this toward the end of the month. Kelly's going to be reading this as well in December, and we may actually do a kind of joint review video of it for the end of the project. If so, that should be a lot of fun. I look forward to it. But anyway, thank you for watching. And if you read the Julian Barnes memoir, please let me know what you thought of the book in the comments below. Anyway, I hope y'all had a great Thanksgiving if you're here in the States. And if you're not, I hope you have some really wonderful reading plans to take you into the weekend. I will talk to you guys again very soon. Adios.